let's take a good close look at a word you're all familiar with. Cheese. Okay, fine. Nation. But I want to talk about cheese one of these days. I still haven't eaten since the geomorphology video. I'm so hungry. Before we jump into it, you might be saying, didn't we just learn about countries? What's the difference? Well, it turns out quite a bit. I should mention that where you live and the language you speak might impact whether you see these two words as being the same or not. In some parts of the world, people use these words interchangeably. For example, when Americans use the word nation, they probably use it to mean the same thing as country. But the United States isn't the only country in the world, though that may come as a shock to some Americans.
Oh!
And for most of the world, a country and a nation are actually two things that are distinct and different. Here's standard definition of nation. Nation, a large body of people united by common descent, culture, language, and/or history. So while a country is defined by land and an independent government, a nation is defined by one or more of these things that make any particular group of people similar to one another. I always imagined Richard and I were like a nation. But he's a jerk and I dumped him, so we won't talk about him. The definition we just read listed 4 specific ingredients that potentially help us identify a nation: common descent, culture, language, and history. Both country and nation are terms used in human geography. But while country generally refers to political geography, nation has more to do with cultural, historical, and/or population geography. So, just to drive it home, country is a term used to describe a political boundary of a government in a given area of land. Nation, on the other hand, is used to define groups of people based on other criteria. Now, let's look at the 4 criteria we talked about earlier, because it can give us a clearer picture of what a nation actually is. What is common descent? Common descent refers to a group of people who come from the same general group of ancestors. They share the same DNA and the same genetics. Every nation has its beginning somewhere. The basic process goes something like this. At some point, a group of people separates themselves from their current group, their mother nation. Not to be confused with their stepmother nation, which would lock the new group of people in a tower. Whew. Many things could cause this separation: food, water, conflict, climate, wanting to take a break and see other people. Whatever that means. I miss you, Richard. Whatever the reason, this new separated group begins to grow, change, and develop in their new home in a new and unique way. For thousands of years, these separations usually meant that people were pretty permanently isolated from their mother nation. Before modern forms of transportation, you couldn't take a flight back home for the long weekend. In most cases, once you left, you were gone for good. The genetics of the group of people has become distinct to reflect the specific group that broke away, or maybe they came into contact with another nation living in their new area, and they began to intermix with them. A few generations go by, and what do you know? You've got yourself a new nation. As more generations of this nation go by, the nation becomes more established and more distinct from their original mother nation. That's what could have happened with us, Richard. As a group of people shares a set of DNA over the generations, they start to develop more distinct physical features, such as skin tone, hair color, hair type, physical features, stature, and more. That common descent starts to take on different looks among people. Often, when we talk about the common descents of nations, we use another important word: ethnicity. Ethnicity includes the common descent ingredient of a nation, or, as we said, a group that shares the same DNA. Members of the same ethnicity are often called an ethnic group. But ethnicity is more than just genetics alone. Usually, an ethnicity is formed when a group of people with a common descent adds another distinct component to their group. In fact, it's our second ingredient for making a nation: culture.
Culture is a huge topic, one with way more than we successfully cover right now. It includes a set of its own sub-ingredients. Perhaps some of the most common sub-ingredients of culture include language, religion, symbols, values, norms and social customs, the arts, and family structures.
I noticed that one of these elements of culture you just mentioned is language. Well, language, it turns out, is so essential to our communication and way of life that it deserves special consideration when it comes to a nation, and is our third ingredient. Communication could save your relationship, but Richard never communicated. And the fourth ingredient, history, is closely related. I mean, every new nation once shared common descent and culture as part of their mother nation, as we just learned. And before more modern forms of transportation and communication, we learned that often, once separated, these groups would remain largely isolated from one another and evolve and change along their own nation's path going forward. But in more modern times, these separations weren't as permanent. Groups could separate but still maintain much of their same culture and definitely maintain the same common descent. Ships and postal systems made it easier to remain connected to their mother nation. But that doesn't mean that the new nations still don't form. That's because once they become separated from one another, regardless of how strong the ties are still with their mother nation, the new nation still began their own trajectory of history. That also seems to be the case with old loves that drift apart, doesn't it, Richard? All you had to do was text me back. Even in relatively recent times, new languages, or at least new dialects of their own language, have emerged from separated groups. So what we sometimes end up with are nations who share a common ethnicity, common descent, plus culture with another nation, but are still considered separate nations anyway because of their differences in history and/or language. We saw this type of thing happen quite often during periods of colonialism, where many members of certain nations would travel and settle in the far corners of the world. These colonists would live among other existing nations and often essentially take them over. In most cases, these colonists would still maintain their previous national identity. At least they would in the beginning. But sometimes absence doesn't make the heart grow fonder. But sometimes it still does. And identifying fully with their mother nation didn't last forever. As the paths of these two groups diverged, new identities formed, new histories began. Even new languages evolved, like Afrikaans in South Africa, which evolved from the Dutch language, or the difference you hear in English dialects between America, Australia, and England. Essentially, what tended to happen was that you saw members of one nation living far from their place of national origin start to change their identity. Within a few short generations, many of them identified more closely with their new home, their new nation, than their original mother nation. Sometimes outright breakups happened, like with me and Richard. At times, it was dramatic, resulting in war and conflict, like with me and Richard. Think about the American Revolution, for example. While understanding countries is important when it comes to understanding political geography, if we really want to understand human geography and therefore understand the world too, we have to understand more about nations. And while we learned that it is hard to define exactly how many countries there are in the world, it is even harder to identify how many nations there are. Think about it this way. There are more than 5,000 distinct ethnic groups defined in the world today. That means at least that many groups who, at some point, developed in relative isolation from one another. And maybe that isolation is good. maybe Richard and I will be better off apart. On top of that, there are more than 7,000 languages still spoken on our planet by human beings today. When you add in all the variety of different histories and cultural combination, there are likely tens of thousands of groups who could be correctly called nations living on Earth today. Or at least I think so. I'm a geography host, not a math host. Of course, it is impossible to fully understand every nation in the world. But whenever we study a country, region, or continent in this world, let's take a moment to consider the diversity of the nation as well.